he enjoyed himself thoroughly, I think. And I think both you and I have been very lucky to have this man cross our paths and being able to spend some time with him.
You know, Ernie Coombs Mr Dressup, he really was a class act.
Yeah.
And I don't think that Canada knew what a gem it had until his passing.
Well, one of the headlines that really impressed me was the author, it was a female, wrote it and says, "I always wanted him to be my father." And I think that's how the kids see him. That's how the adults see him. I have never seen somebody cause such a sensation when you mention his name with the women. I asked him one time, "What's your secret? What's your magic? How come?" Every time I said, "Oh, I'm going to go take some photos of Ernie Coombs, Mr. Dressup," and they all go gaga. You'd swear they're going to... They have the impression I'm going to meet the world's greatest lover, I think, somehow, or the world's greatest father, something along those lines.
I found out in talking with him that many times he would meet some fans. The one thing they would all want to do is hug him.
Well, that's exactly where he's at. That's exactly where he's at. And again, let's like I said, I also met Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, who Ernie and he are out of the same pod. And I found out later from Ernie, and I guess it's documented as well, they both came up to Toronto for a job to work on a kids program. And then Fred got called back to start his own show, and Ernie said, "Well, what do I do? Where am I?" And Fred just said, "Well, just carry on with what I started." And that's exactly what happened. That's where they both came up with the same work. Ernie was Fred's assistant, and then they both split up, and they both did the same thing for the next 30-some-odd years, which is amazing for two careers to parallel like that.
And the fact that they were very good friends, did exactly the same type of work.
Yeah.
One stayed in the United States, which was Fred Rogers,
Yeah.
and we had our Mr. Dressup up here in Canada.
What I enjoyed with Fred when he came up to record his bit for the Arthur series was we were getting into the studio, and he paused for a moment, took himself aside, took off his leisure jacket, put on a cardigan, changed his shoes, and went into the studio and performed as Mr. Rogers. He had to physically change his clothes to become the character, which was neat to see. And then later on, he went up to the studios to meet several of the artists and the animators. And his producer or manager was standing at the doorway, tapping his wrist and pointing to the watch and saying, "Fred, we got 20 minutes to make it to the airport to catch our flight. And Fred, there's just one more person over here who I haven't seen yet. Just give me a minute." And he made sure that he met and shook hands with everybody in the studio, personally. And he had the time for everybody. And during his break time in the studio, he'd pull out some postcards and write postcards to fans. And that's how giving this person was, constantly.
Let's also mention here that you've worked with some other big-name performers. You've worked with Christopher Plummer.
I definitely had the pleasure and the fun to work with Christopher Plummer. That was thrown at me very quickly. It wasn't intended for me to go work in a session with him. But we had a producer who had phoned Christopher Plummer personally at home. And Chris just blew a gasket at this young man. And he was afraid to go to the recording session, so me being the innocent standby went in. And the first thing, we flew into Toronto to record him, and the first thing Christopher Plummer looked around and says, "Where's the gentleman that I blew my top at?" And I started to laugh. I said, "Well, he was afraid to come in." And Chris started to laugh. He said, "Well, you got to tell him I apologize big time because I did the wrong thing." He says he phoned me at home. He shouldn't have, but I shouldn't have blown my top, and send him my apologies. And after that, he signed autographs on programs and scripts for people in the studio and stuff like that. And again, a very giving, genuine person I found, and I had a good time, working with him. Great pleasure with that too.
What can you tell us about James Wood?
Oh, wow, that's going back a bit. James came up to Montreal to work on Joshua Then and Now. I was working at that time in live action. And it was a 3-month shoot. We're making what would have been a 2-part miniseries for TV and a theatrical release. And James Woods was giving a hard time to a lot of the cast and crew at the time of telling people to stay out of his eye line, and he was trying to focus and trying to stay in character and whatnot. And I found a lot of the production crew kind of like really putting him down, saying bad things. And it wasn't until the last 2 weeks that I was working there with him. We got in his Winnebago. We're sitting down, James, his driver, and myself, and we're having a casual conversation. And then things started coming out like, he says, this is really the biggest project I've worked on. Last 6 months I've been on a friend's couch in New York City, and that I didn't have 50 cents to get a cup of coffee. And then I'm saying, you know what, there's a lot of pressure on this guy. And he's trying to give his best, and his best could only come with really focusing and keeping that energy with himself. And he had all the right to tell people who were very casual and happy-go-lucky around him to say, listen, I'm trying to work, and I'm trying to focus, and it's very important to me, and I'm trying to give the best I could. Unfortunately, I think they took it in the wrong way. And that's where somebody will kind of come across looking angry, miserable, mean, and frustrated. So he put in what I would consider a very genuine, top-notch job in that film. And I found him, towards the end of this, really a likable person again. And I think he's done fantastic stuff since. He's been really top-notch after that.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test, a man's guide to the emotional needs of women. What would your life be like if you knew exactly what to say and do with women? This book is for the guy that simply wants to learn how to handle women's tests by addressing her emotional needs. By this, you create the type of attraction that will make her see you as the one she was destined to be with. This book will teach you how to get the woman you want and how to keep her. Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test is the Rosetta Stone for men to understand exactly what a woman means when she speaks and how to respond. Is that worth changing your life forever? Buy this book at franktalks.com now.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by From Loser to Seducer by Frank B. Kermit. Ladies, is there a man in your life that got dumped for being clingy, needy, or was told he was a loser, but you still think he's a nice guy and want to help him? He could be a relative or even a friend, and you know he needs the help. Do you want to be the one to give him the gift that will change his life forever? How about the gift of a great biography? Buy him the book, From Loser to Seducer by Frank B. Kermit. It is the story of a nice guy who triumphs over his inner demons to find his own hidden power. Help the nice guy in your life discover his inner seducer to find his soulmate. Buy this book now at franktalks.com.
Honest, frank approaches, trusted professional conduct, timely taboo topics, and the most eclectic ensemble of interview guests ever produced. Listen to Frank Talks to learn about the different sides of the human spirit. Be sure to visit our website at www.franktalks.com for the most up-to-date information and the latest downloads of programs just like the one you're listening to now.